Tourists flock to Rome by the millions every year, taking in the grandeur of the old imperial capital and using their imaginations to reconstruct the ancient city as they try to picture what life would have been like 2,000 years ago. Unfortunately, even with the most magnificent ruins, such as the Pantheon and the Colosseum, it can be difficult to fully immerse yourself in the past and put yourself in the shoes of someone who stood in the same spot during the height of Roman civilization. The task becomes exponentially more difficult in the Roman Forum, where solitary columns and sparse concrete foundations are all we have left to mentally reconstruct the splendor of Rome. But there is still one building in the Forum that tourists can enter which is more or less unchanged, one that immediately upon entrance places the visitor in direct communion with those who came before and effortlessly evokes the real emotions that would have been experienced. But the feelings replicated here are not those that inspire reverence for Rome, but rather horror at the human cost of Rome's desire to build an empire without limit. This is the Mamertine Prison, known in Latin as the Tullianum, the only prison the Romans ever built to incarcerate enemies of the state. In addition to being one of the best preserved buildings in the Forum, it is also one of the oldest, tracing its origins to Ancus Marcius, the fourth king of Rome. Originally a subterranean cistern with archaic origins, tradition holds that Ancus Marcius was the first to consign his enemies to the small pit from which there was no escape. Death was the only way out, as the sole prison in Rome was typically used to house prisoners that were too valuable to be executed immediately. Public humiliation had to come first. Only after being paraded through the city in chains as part of a triumph or other public spectacle would they be led back to the Tullianum to be ceremonially strangled one at a time. The design was strikingly simple. The prison consisted of an upper chamber at street level, whose sole unique feature was a small hole in the center of the room that was just large enough for a man to be lowered through. It is in the sheer darkness of this smaller, lower underground chamber that prisoners would have been held in abject misery. Sallust describes the prison as well as the horrifying reputation it had among the ancient Romans. There is a place called the Tullianum, about 12 feet below the surface of the ground. It is enclosed on all sides by walls, and above it is a chamber with a vaulted roof of stone. Neglect, darkness, and stench make it hideous and fearsome to behold. Little about the prison seems to have changed during the roughly 1,000 years it was in use. After all, if no one can escape, then the pragmatic Romans saw no need to alter the prison, though today we would all find the dark, claustrophobic hole shockingly inhumane. The Romans would not have been moved by any appeals to human dignity or claims that their prisoners deserved sunlight and functioning plumbing. But before you accuse us of unfairly projecting modern incarceration standards on the Romans, it must be noted that the Romans themselves were aware of how inhumane the prison was. In the words of Calpurnius Flaccus, "I can visualize the state prison, constructed of huge stone blocks, receiving through the narrow chinks just a faint semblance of light. Culprits cast into this prison look forward to the execution cell, and whenever the creaking of the iron-bound door stirs those helpless, sprawled-out people, they are terrified, and by viewing someone else's punishment, they learn of their own soon to come. Whiplashes crack. Food is delivered in the foul hands of the executioner to those who then refuse it. The hard-hearted doorkeeper sits by, a man whose eyes would remain dry even when his mother weeps. Filth roughen their bodies, chains grip their hands tightly." This is what makes a visit to the prison a true step backward in time. Not only is the chamber well preserved, it perfectly evokes the world view of those who utilized it, while allowing visitors to understand some small aspect of the despair that those incarcerated in the prison would have experienced. Any time spent here will make it abundantly clear that there is a wide gulf between ourselves and the Romans on questions of criminal justice. It is precisely because of this divergent attitude regarding crime and punishment that the Tullianum was able to serve as the sole prison in all of Rome. In antiquity, there was no concept of the prison as a place to hold criminals for sustained periods as a form of punishment, and certainly no inkling of the idea that it was the state's responsibility to reform offenders through rehabilitative incarceration. Imprisonment was something that only really happened before a trial. After a trial, there was no real point in holding someone captive. You simply fulfilled the sentence. Like other ancient societies, Roman justice was swift and brutal, with death sentences being doled out at an astounding rate, and involuntary servitude being another common form of punishment. It sounds inhumane, because it is, but from the ancients' point of view, it did make some sense. Ancient societies lacked the surplus in resources needed to feed a non-laboring population, necessitating either the quick death of the offenders, placing them in debt bondage, or consigning them to hard labor. However, if one was very wealthy and well-connected, there was always a chance of escaping into exile, even for crimes such as murder that would have seen the poor executed. Despite this inconsistency, the Tullianum prison was not reserved for the poor and foreign enemies alone. Many upper-class Romans who ran afoul of the state would be imprisoned here prior to their deaths. Among those include Herennius Siculus, who was an ally of Gaius Gracchus, slated for execution for the crime of attempting to reform the state in favor of the poor. Rather than submit to the shameful strangulation that he knew was inevitable, he bashed his own head against the walls until he died. The prison would be the site of significant political conflict during Cicero's consulship, after the unveiling of Catiline's conspiracy to overthrow the Republic. Cicero and Cato led an optimate faction of conservative aristocrats that called for the immediate deaths of all men named as conspirators, treating them as enemies of war and not offering the trial due to them as Roman citizens. Caesar opposed this and suggested something radical: perpetual incarceration as punishment instead of death. Claiming that death was irrevocable, Caesar argued in front of the Senate that the men should be dispersed throughout Italy and each held in perpetuity in separate towns, as he sought something tougher than exile but more lenient than the death penalty. Cato argued forcefully against this by claiming there was no precedent in Roman law for such punishment. These speeches, or at least something based on them, are recorded in Sallust and make for fascinating reading that illuminates the stark differences between the late Republic's fiercest ideologues. But ultimately, Caesar had the last laugh, as the societies descended from Rome have adopted his suggestion of perpetual incarceration, even for the harshest crimes. In addition, the backlash against Cicero for ordering the execution of these citizens without trial would ultimately prove so great that he was exiled, and his home leveled soon after leaving his consulship. Over the course of the centuries, the Tullianum prison would house a number of prominent opponents of Roman imperialism, including Eumenes III, a rebel and pretender to the throne of Pergamum, Caesar's enemy Vercingetorix, and the Jewish revolutionary Simon Bar Giora. These men were all strangled in the prison after being marched through the city in triumph. But a worse fate awaited Jugurtha, the Numidian king who had humiliated Roman armies in Africa and had used his wealth to openly bribe senators. Plutarch describes his grisly end after his capture by Marius. But we are told that when he, Jugurtha, had been led in triumph, he lost his reason, and that when, after the triumph, he was cast into prison, where some tore his tunic from his body, and others were so eager to snatch away his golden earring that they tore it off, with it the lobe of his ear. And when he had been thrust down naked into the dungeon pit, in utter bewilderment, and with a grin on his lips, he said, "Hercules, how cold this Roman bath is!" But the wretch, after struggling with hunger for 6 days, and up to the last moment clinging to the desire of life, paid the penalty which his crimes deserved. The small hole in the ground that was the holding place for enemies of the Roman state would be a witness to the dramatic transformation of the Forum, as the growing wealth of the Republic, and later Empire, transformed its surroundings from a bucolic marsh to the gilded center of the world's greatest city. The prison itself was witness to this transformation, as those originally incarcerated within its walls would have merely been feuding chieftains from rival Latin settlements. But over the course of Roman expansion, the Mamertine Prison would house foreign kings and other illustrious dignitaries who dared resist the might of Rome. But though the Mamertine Prison was itself a monument to Rome's seemingly unbreakable power and the fate that would befall all who displeased it, today the Mamertine Prison is a reminder that resistance is not always futile. The prison can only be accessed through a 17th century Catholic church, which was built there on top of an older Christian site dedicated to commemorating Peter and Paul, who were said to be held in Mamertine Prison prior to their execution by Nero. Indeed, it was the incarceration of these two men that resulted in the most significant changes to the interior of the Mamertine Prison. In addition to the staircase that makes it possible to enter the cell more comfortably than being lowered through a small hole, the prison now houses an altar in honor of Peter and Paul, transforming what was once the location of Rome's most horrifying prison into a shrine for some of those who spent their last days here. Commenting on how readily Rome adopted Greek philosophy and art, the poet Horace famously wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror." The same could be said for how the nascent Christian church, which spent 3 uncertain centuries under the heel of Rome in alternating stages of persecution and toleration, would eventually conquer the empire that sought to stamp it out. Now, the prison has been robbed of its ability to inspire terror, and those that descend into it do so willingly. History is full of little ironies.
Hi, this is Titus from Tribunet. If you enjoyed the video you just saw by Gaius, and if you're interested in thoughtful content that explores the complex culture of the ancient Romans, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.